They thought they were laughing at a maid with broken English. But before the morning was over, they would discover that the loudest voices in the room belonged to the least intelligent people sitting around the table. Monday sunlight spilled through the towering glass walls of Romano Global Headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, painting long ribbons of gold across polished marble floors that reflected every hurried footstep inside the executive building. The annual board meeting was less than 20 minutes away, and executives from across the country arrived carrying leather portfolios, financial reports, and enough confidence to fill the enormous conference room on the top floor. Every decision made during the next few hours could change the future of the company, yet very few people noticed the quiet woman carefully arranging fresh coffee, crystal water glasses, and neatly folded linen napkins before the meeting began. Grace Johnson moved silently from one end of the conference table to the other, making certain every chair had exactly what each director would need. Her black and white maid uniform was spotless despite the early hour, and her calm expression never changed as she worked with practiced precision. Whenever someone thanked her, she answered with a gentle smile and a soft reply that carried traces of an accent she had never completely lost after arriving in America several years earlier. She understood more English than most people realized, but speaking it remained difficult. Every sentence required concentration, every unfamiliar sound demanded patience, and every mistake reminded her that learning another language took courage most people never appreciated. Unfortunately, courage was not something everyone in the building respected. Two board members entered the conference room while discussing quarterly projections before one of them noticed Grace placing another cup beside the head chair reserved for Ethan Romano. "Excuse me," the older executive said without looking directly at her. "Can you bring more sugar?" Grace nodded politely. "Yes, sir. I bring it right away." Her grammar stumbled, and one word came out with an awkward pronunciation. The younger executive laughed immediately. "Did you hear that?" he asked with an amused grin. "I thought we were doing business in New York, not attending beginner English class." Another director walking through the doorway chuckled as he overheard the remark. Within moments, several quiet laughs drifted around the polished conference room. No one shouted. No one insulted her openly. The mockery came disguised as harmless humor, the kind that allowed people to pretend they had done nothing wrong while slowly stripping another person's dignity away. Grace heard every word. She lowered her eyes for only a second before calmly placing the sugar bowl beside the coffee service exactly where it belonged. She had experienced moments like this before. Correcting strangers rarely changed their hearts, and arguing with wealthy executives was never worth sacrificing her peace. She simply continued working with steady hands and quiet professionalism. None of them knew what she did every evening after finishing 12-hour shifts. None of them knew about the worn English workbook waiting beside her apartment window, the handwritten vocabulary cards taped across her refrigerator, or the hours she spent repeating unfamiliar words until midnight because she believed effort mattered more than embarrassment. They saw broken English. They never bothered looking for determination. Outside the conference room, the private elevator doors opened almost silently. Ethan Romano stepped into the executive hallway wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, his expression composed, his movements deliberate. Employees greeted him respectfully as he walked toward the boardroom, but he slowed before reaching the entrance. Through the partially opened door, he heard another quiet burst of laughter followed by Grace apologizing for mispronouncing a single word. He did not enter. He did not interrupt. Instead, he remained where no one inside could see him, listening carefully as each member of his board revealed far more about themselves than they realized. A leader who judged people too quickly rarely learned the truth, and Ethan had built his empire by allowing arrogance to expose itself before he ever spoke. As the final directors took their seats around the massive walnut table, the room buzzed with confidence, ambition, and hidden pride. Grace gathered the empty serving tray and turned toward the exit, believing the laughter behind her would soon be forgotten like every other ordinary humiliation she had quietly endured. She had no idea that before the meeting ended, the same people who had smiled at her mistakes would be waiting in complete silence for her to speak. 3 weeks earlier, long before anyone inside Romano Global questioned her intelligence, Grace Johnson measured her days not by the clock on the office wall, but by the quiet promises she made to herself before the sun came up. Every weekday began before 5 o'clock in the morning inside her small apartment in northern Manhattan, where a second-hand alarm clock rested beside a stack of worn English textbooks filled with handwritten notes. Before putting on her neatly pressed black and white Maid uniform, she spent 30 minutes reading aloud from newspaper articles, carefully practicing unfamiliar words that refused to come naturally. Sometimes she repeated the same sentence 10 or 15 times until she could pronounce it with greater confidence. She knew her grammar was imperfect, and her accent remained strong, but she believed that steady effort mattered more than quick results. After arriving at Romano Global, she greeted every security officer, receptionist, and maintenance worker by name. She remembered birthdays, asked about sick family members, and quietly offered encouragement to anyone carrying a difficult burden. Many employees considered her the kindest person in the building because she never treated anyone differently based on job title. One rainy afternoon, a young financial analyst rushed through the lobby after accidentally dropping an envelope filled with confidential documents. While dozens of employees hurried past without noticing, Grace calmly gathered every page before a single sheet could become soaked by the rain blowing through the revolving doors. Instead of simply returning the envelope, she carefully organized every document exactly as she had found it. The grateful analyst offered her $100 as a reward, but Grace smiled politely and declined. Helping should not have a price, she answered with quiet sincerity. Her English stumbled over one or two words, yet the meaning reached everyone who heard it. Later that same week, she found an expensive fountain pen engraved with the initials of one of the senior executives. Rather than placing it in Lost and Found, she personally walked through several departments until she located its owner. The executive barely looked up from his computer while thanking her, never realizing she had saved an irreplaceable gift passed down from his father. Grace never expected recognition. She believed character was built through actions that no one applauded. Every evening after finishing long shifts, she visited the neighborhood public library before returning home. She borrowed books about American business culture, communication, and leadership because she wanted to understand more than vocabulary. She wanted to understand people. Librarians often noticed her sitting near the same window until closing time, whispering difficult sentences to herself while marking pronunciation guides inside a small notebook. Few people knew that before coming to the United States, Grace had managed a successful family import business in West Africa alongside her father. Years of economic hardship and her mother's declining health forced her to leave that life behind in search of stable work abroad. Pride had never frightened her as much as hunger or unpaid medical bills. She accepted honest work without shame because dignity came from integrity, not occupation. Unknown to Grace, someone else inside Romano Global had quietly noticed those same qualities. On several occasions, Ethan Romano crossed paths with her during early mornings before most executives arrived. He watched her return lost property without hesitation, help exhausted employees without being asked, and spend lunch breaks studying English instead of resting. He never interrupted those moments or introduced himself beyond a courteous greeting. He simply observed. Experience had taught him that true character appeared most clearly when people believed no one important was watching. By the time the annual board meeting approached, Ethan already understood something the rest of his executives had failed to see. Grace Johnson spoke imperfect English, but she possessed uncommon discipline, genuine humility, and practical wisdom that could not be measured by flawless pronunciation. The annual board meeting represented far more than another quarterly review for Romano Global. Hidden behind polished presentations and carefully rehearsed financial forecasts stood an international partnership capable of reshaping the company's future for decades. Ethan Romano had spent nearly 2 years preparing negotiations with one of the largest logistics and infrastructure groups in West Africa, a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars that promised new ports, transportation networks, and thousands of future jobs. Investors celebrated the opportunity. Newspapers praised the company's ambition, and every executive arriving at headquarters believed success was only one signature away. Yet Ethan carried a concern he had shared with no one. During months of private conversations with international advisors, he realized that the greatest obstacle was not financing, competition, or government approval. The real danger came from misunderstanding people. Several members of the board viewed the upcoming negotiations as if every market behaved exactly like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. They focused on numbers, contracts, and deadlines while paying little attention to relationships, cultural respect, and the patience required to build genuine trust. During preparation meetings, one director confidently insisted that efficiency mattered more than personal connection. Another dismissed local customs as unnecessary distractions that only delayed profitable decisions. Ethan listened without interrupting, making notes while quietly recognizing that confidence often concealed ignorance more effectively than silence ever could. Every discussion convinced him that the people responsible for protecting the company's future understood spreadsheets better than human nature. One afternoon, after another frustrating strategy session, Ethan stood alone beside the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. Snow drifted slowly between the surrounding skyscrapers, while thousands of people hurried through streets far below. His chief legal advisor entered the office carrying updated briefing materials and cautiously asked whether the board seemed fully prepared. Ethan answered without turning away from the glass. "They have studied the reports," he said calmly. "I am not certain they have studied the people." Those simple words revealed everything he feared. Contracts could always be revised. Broken trust rarely could. Later that evening, while most executives had already gone home, Ethan walked through the nearly empty headquarters toward the employee cafeteria. As he passed one of the small conference rooms, he noticed the lights were still on. Through the partially opened door, he saw Grace Johnson sitting alone with an old notebook, practicing English sentences while reading an article about international commerce. She quietly repeated difficult business vocabulary, stopping occasionally to write pronunciation notes beside unfamiliar expressions. On the table rested a borrowed library book discussing cultural leadership across African markets. Ethan remained unnoticed for several moments. Then Grace reached a paragraph describing the importance of earning respect before discussing business. Although several words challenged her pronunciation, she smiled after finally reading the passage correctly. Ethan continued walking without disturbing her, but that brief moment confirmed something he had already suspected. The executives preparing to negotiate abroad possessed polished language, yet limited understanding. The maid cleaning their offices possessed imperfect English, yet spent her evenings studying the very cultures the company hoped to serve. The contrast stayed with him throughout the week. By the morning of the board meeting, Ethan had already made one quiet decision. He would allow every executive to reveal exactly how they judged another person's value before asking anyone in the room to speak about leadership. Sometimes the fastest way to expose arrogance was not through argument, but through opportunity. And before the day was over, the most overlooked woman inside Romano Global would become the unexpected measure of every person seated around that polished walnut table. The conference room settled into expectant silence as the final presentation appeared across the enormous digital screen. Charts filled with projections, international shipping routes, and investment forecasts glowed beneath the soft recessed lighting, while every board member prepared to defend months of planning. Ethan Romano stood at the head of the polished walnut table without opening the meeting immediately. Instead, he allowed his eyes to travel slowly around the room, studying each face with the same patience that had built both his business empire and his reputation. Every executive looked prepared. Every portfolio contained polished research. Every confident smile suggested they believed success was already guaranteed. Grace Johnson quietly entered one last time carrying a silver tray with fresh coffee for the directors who had arrived late. She moved carefully between expensive leather chairs, making certain not to interrupt the discussion that had already begun among the board members. As she placed a cup beside one director, another executive glanced toward her and asked for additional cream. Grace answered politely, "Yes, sir. I bring fresh one right now." Her sentence contained another small grammatical mistake. A faint laugh escaped from one corner of the room. Then another followed. Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Maybe we should hire an English teacher before we hire another maid." Several directors smiled behind their coffee cups. One woman quietly shook her head with amused disbelief. "She probably does not even understand what this meeting is about," she murmured. Grace paused for only a heartbeat before continuing toward the service station. Her shoulders remained straight. Her expression remained peaceful. She had learned long ago that another person's opinion could only become permanent if she accepted it as truth. Ethan watched every reaction without speaking. He noticed who laughed openly. He noticed who remained silent. More importantly, he noticed who looked uncomfortable but lacked the courage to defend someone with less authority than themselves. Character often revealed itself most clearly during moments when kindness required personal risk. The conversation soon returned to international expansion. One director confidently declared that negotiations should move quickly because business was business everywhere. Another insisted cultural consultants only complicated simple agreements. Ethan calmly asked whether anyone had first-hand experience working within the regions they hoped to enter. The room became noticeably quieter. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances before offering theoretical answers based on market reports, consulting presentations, and economic forecasts. Not one person described genuine personal experience. Ethan thanked them without revealing disappointment. Grace quietly returned with the requested cream and placed it beside the director who had asked for it. As she turned to leave, one executive jokingly asked, "Do you know where West Africa is?" A few restrained laughs spread around the table again. Grace answered honestly, "Yes, sir." Before she could say another word, someone interrupted with another smile. "Well, that is already better than your English." More laughter followed. This time the sound echoed across the conference room before fading into awkward silence. Ethan slowly closed the presentation remote in his hand. The movement alone drew every eye toward him. Without raising his voice or changing his calm expression, he looked directly at Grace. "Miss Johnson," he said evenly, "please do not leave." Confusion immediately spread across the room. Grace stopped beside the conference room doors and turned respectfully toward him. Ethan walked to the empty chair halfway down the long walnut table, the chair reserved for visiting consultants. He gently pulled it away from the table before looking back at her once more. "Please," he said with quiet authority, "take this seat. I would like you to address the board before anyone else continues this discussion." The room fell into complete silence because no one could understand why the most powerful man in the building had just invited the quiet maid they had mocked only moments earlier to speak before the highest decision-makers inside Romano Global. For several long seconds, no one moved. Grace Johnson remained standing beside the conference room door, convinced she had misunderstood what Ethan Romano had asked of her. The invitation seemed impossible. Around the polished walnut table sat executives with graduate degrees, decades of corporate experience, and careers built inside boardrooms exactly like this one. She was the woman who cleaned those boardrooms after everyone else had gone home. Slowly she looked toward Ethan, searching his face for any sign that he was making a joke, but there was none. His expression remained calm, respectful, and completely sincere. "Please, Miss Johnson," he repeated. "The seat is yours." Grace carefully placed the silver serving tray on a nearby cabinet before walking toward the empty chair. Every step echoed softly across the marble floor. She could feel dozens of eyes following her, some filled with disbelief, others with quiet irritation, and a few with growing curiosity. As she reached the chair, Ethan waited until she was seated before returning to his place at the head of the table. The silence had become so complete that even the gentle hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Ethan folded his hands. "Our company is preparing to build a long-term partnership in West Africa," he said. "Before this board makes another recommendation, I would like to hear your thoughts." Grace hesitated for only a moment. "Sir, my English is not perfect." Ethan nodded once. "I did not ask for perfect English. I asked for your thoughts." Those words changed something inside the room. Grace took a slow breath and began speaking carefully, choosing every sentence with patience rather than speed. "Many people think business start with contract," she said. "Sometimes it start much earlier. It start when people feel respected." Several executives exchanged brief glances, expecting her to finish after only a few sentences. Instead, she continued with increasing confidence. She explained that in many communities, relationships often develop before agreements. She described how visiting local leaders, listening without rushing conversations, and showing genuine interest in families and communities could establish trust that no legal document could replace. She spoke about how arriving with humility communicated strength rather than weakness, and how trying to control every discussion too quickly could quietly damage negotiations before they truly began. Her grammar still carried imperfections, yet every observation reflected practical experience instead of theory. Ethan remained completely silent, allowing every word to settle naturally over the room. Grace continued by describing how successful partnerships depended upon understanding local priorities instead of assuming that every market valued identical goals. She explained that listening carefully often revealed opportunities hidden behind formal presentations, and that patience frequently produced stronger agreements than aggressive deadlines. One director slowly lowered the presentation notes he had prepared earlier. Another removed his reading glasses without realizing he had stopped reviewing financial projections several minutes before. No one interrupted. No one smiled. No one laughed. The same executives who had mocked her pronunciation now leaned forward with genuine attention because substance had quietly overcome appearance. Grace finally concluded with a simple thought. People remember how you make them feel before they remember what you asked them to sign. Respect is good business. When she finished speaking, she folded her hands in her lap and lowered her eyes modestly, believing she had probably spoken too long. Instead, the conference room remained completely silent. The silence no longer carried embarrassment or ridicule. It carried reflection. For the first time that morning, every person around the table realized they had been listening not to a maid struggling with English, but to someone whose understanding of people reached far beyond anything printed inside the expensive reports resting unopened before them. Ethan Romano allowed the silence to remain, untouched for several more seconds because he understood that some lessons lost their power when spoken too quickly. The executives who had laughed only minutes earlier now avoided looking at one another. Their polished presentations suddenly seemed far less impressive than the quiet wisdom they had just heard from the woman they had dismissed before learning her story. Ethan slowly stood and walked toward the large screen displaying the company's international expansion strategy. Without saying a word, he pressed a button on the remote, replacing colorful financial charts with a single employee profile. Grace looked up in surprise as her own personnel file appeared before the board. A few directors shifted uneasily in their chairs. They had never imagined that the chief executive officer would devote valuable board meeting time to discussing the background of a member of the housekeeping staff. Ethan looked around the room before speaking in the same calm voice that had commanded respect throughout his career. Several years ago, he began, this company received an employment application from a woman who never mentioned everything she had accomplished because she believed honest work did not require an explanation. He paused before continuing. Most people read only the first page of her file. I read every page. He changed to the next document. It showed business records from West Africa, references from former partners, and certifications from international trade programs completed years before Grace had arrived in the United States. Ethan continued, before becoming a housekeeper in this building, Miss Johnson helped manage a successful family import business. She negotiated with suppliers across multiple countries, coordinated transportation networks, and worked directly with communities that many of us are now trying to understand through consulting reports. No one interrupted. Ethan turned toward Grace with genuine respect. She never asked for recognition. She never demanded a different position. She accepted honest work with dignity while continuing to learn every single day. Grace lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Ethan looked back at the board. Some of you judged her intelligence after hearing one imperfect sentence. I judged her character after watching months of consistent actions. He reminded them how she had returned valuable property without expecting a reward, how she had helped employees without seeking attention, and how she spent evenings studying business communication after completing 12-hour shifts. Knowledge can be purchased through education, he said quietly. Character cannot. The room remained completely still. Even those who had remained silent during the earlier mockery now understood that silence had not protected them from responsibility. Ethan continued with one final revelation. I heard every joke made before this meeting began. I chose not to interrupt because I wanted each of you to reveal how quickly you measure another person's worth. Leadership is not demonstrated by how we treat successful people. Leadership is revealed by how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. His words settled over the room with quiet weight. Several executives slowly lowered their heads. Others stared at the table in thoughtful silence, recognizing that their assumptions had exposed weaknesses no financial report could measure. Grace never smiled with satisfaction, never displayed pride, and never reminded anyone of the laughter she had endured. She simply remained seated with the same humility she had carried into the room that morning. In that moment, Ethan realized the greatest qualification for leadership had never been flawless speech, prestigious titles, or impressive resumes. It had always been the quiet strength to preserve dignity while the world underestimated you, and everyone around the table understood they had just witnessed exactly that. No one reached for the financial reports anymore. The thick binders that had filled the conference table with confidence now remained closed because the conversation had moved beyond numbers. Ethan Romano slowly returned to his seat, allowing the weight of his words to settle naturally instead of forcing a conclusion. After nearly a minute of complete silence, the oldest director on the board cleared his throat and looked toward Grace Johnson with an expression very different from the one he had worn earlier that morning. "Miss Johnson," he said carefully, "would you be willing to explain how you would approach our first meeting with the regional leadership team?" His voice contained neither sarcasm nor superiority. It carried genuine curiosity. Grace looked briefly toward Ethan, who simply nodded with quiet encouragement. She folded her hands before answering. "I would listen before I speak," she replied. "Every community has people who earn trust. I would meet them first. I would ask questions before making promises, because when people feel respected, they share problems that reports cannot show." She explained that business leaders often focused on impressive presentations while overlooking local teachers, business owners, transportation managers, and community organizations that understood daily realities far better than formal statistics ever could. She recommended visiting neighborhoods without large media events, allowing conversations to happen naturally instead of turning every meeting into a public announcement. She described how remembering names, honoring commitments, and arriving on time built confidence one relationship at a time. The board members began taking notes. The same executives who had ignored her presence while she served coffee now wrote down nearly every sentence she spoke. One director quietly admitted that none of their consulting documents had mentioned several of the practical observations Grace had just shared. Another acknowledged that their proposed negotiation schedule now seemed rushed after hearing her perspective. Ethan watched the transformation without satisfaction or triumph. He had not arranged this moment to embarrass anyone. He had arranged it to teach them that wisdom often entered a room wearing clothes that power failed to notice. The chief financial officer closed his laptop and spoke honestly. "We prepared for markets," he said. "She prepared for people." Several heads nodded in agreement. Grace responded with the same humility she had shown all morning. "I am still learning too," she said. Softly. "Nobody knows everything. We all become stronger when we listen to different experiences." Her answer carried no resentment toward those who had mocked her. She did not remind them of their laughter. She offered them the same respect they had failed to offer her only an hour earlier. That quiet generosity affected the room more deeply than any speech could have done. Ethan finally addressed the board once again. "Today we have discovered two valuable assets," he said. "One is an international strategy that has become significantly stronger. The other is a reminder that talent does not always arrive with the title we expect." He then proposed revising the company's negotiation plan using many of Grace's recommendations before any delegation traveled overseas. The motion received unanimous support. Not a single hand opposed it. As the directors looked around the table, they realized that the most important decision made that morning had not appeared anywhere on the official agenda. It had been the decision to replace assumption with understanding, pride with humility, and judgment with the willingness to truly hear the quiet voice they had almost dismissed before giving it the chance to speak. The board meeting concluded hours later, but the atmosphere inside Romano Global had already changed in ways that no quarterly report could measure. As directors quietly gathered their folders and prepared to leave, several paused before walking out of the conference room. The first executive to approach Grace Johnson was the same man who had laughed at her pronunciation earlier that morning. He stood awkwardly beside her chair for a moment, searching for words that seemed much harder to find than they had been only a few hours before. "Miss Johnson," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. I judged you without taking the time to know you, and that was wrong. Grace met his eyes with the same calm kindness she had shown everyone else. "Thank you," she answered gently. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn after them." One by one, other board members stepped forward. None of them offered excuses. None of them blamed misunderstanding or stress. They simply admitted that they had confused imperfect language with limited ability, and each apology carried the quiet humility that had been missing at the beginning of the meeting. Ethan Romano watched from across the room without interrupting. He knew genuine respect could never be demanded. It had to grow naturally from honest reflection. When the last apology had been offered, Ethan addressed Grace in front of the remaining executives. "There is one more decision that should be made today," he said. Every face turned toward him once again. "Effective immediately, I would like to invite you to serve as Cultural and Community Strategy Advisor for our International Expansion Initiative." The room became silent once more, but this silence felt completely different from the one that had followed the morning's laughter. It was filled with admiration instead of disbelief. Grace looked genuinely surprised. "Sir," she said softly, "I am grateful, but I am still learning every day." Ethan smiled faintly. "That is exactly why you are qualified. The people who believe they have nothing left to learn eventually stop growing. You have never stopped." Grace accepted the opportunity with quiet gratitude, asking only one question before agreeing. "May I continue treating everyone with the same respect I always have?" Ethan answered immediately. "That is the one expectation I hope you never change." During the following weeks, Grace joined planning sessions with executives, consultants, and international partners. She never tried to impress anyone with complicated language or corporate vocabulary. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions, encouraged careful listening, and reminded every team member that successful partnerships began with trust long before contracts were signed. Her practical insights reshaped travel schedules, community outreach plans, and leadership training across the company. Employees throughout the headquarters noticed something else changing as well. Executives who had once hurried past custodians, receptionists, and cafeteria workers now greeted them by name. Meetings began with more listening than talking. Managers became more willing to seek ideas from people whose titles had previously gone unnoticed. Grace never claimed credit for those changes because she believed the strongest influence often worked quietly. One evening, after another productive planning session, she walked through the lobby carrying the same small notebook she had filled with English vocabulary for years. The security officer smiled and asked whether she still planned to study after work. Grace laughed softly. "Of course," she replied. "Learning does not end because someone believes in you. It becomes even more important." Ethan happened to hear those words as he crossed the lobby, and he realized that the greatest victory achieved inside Romano Global had never been a business decision at all. It had been the restoration of dignity through humility, proving that true leadership begins the moment people choose to see the worth in another human being before judging the sound of their voice. 6 months later, the conference room on the top floor of Romano Global looked exactly as it had on the morning that changed everything. Yet the people inside it had become remarkably different. Sunlight still poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The polished walnut table still reflected neatly organized reports, and executives still arrived carrying ambitious plans for the future. The difference could not be measured in financial statements or annual reports. It appeared in the small moments that revealed a company's true culture. Receptionists were greeted by name before meetings began. Maintenance employees were thanked instead of ignored. Junior analysts spoke without fear of being dismissed, and experienced directors listened before offering conclusions. Respect had quietly become part of the organization's daily routine. The international partnership that once seemed uncertain had exceeded every expectation. Community leaders welcomed Romano Global because the company had invested time in understanding people before discussing profits. Local businesses became trusted partners instead of temporary vendors. Relationships strengthened with every visit because promises had been matched by consistent actions. Investors celebrated the remarkable results, praising the company's strategy as innovative and unusually sustainable. Only a handful of people inside the boardroom understood that the foundation of that success had begun with a simple lesson about humility. Grace Johnson continued serving as Cultural and Community Strategy Advisor, but very little about her personal habits had changed. She still arrived early each morning carrying the same well-used notebook filled with handwritten English vocabulary. She still spent time at the public library searching for new books about leadership, communication, and international cultures. Even after earning the respect of the company's highest executives, she continued correcting her pronunciation one sentence at a time because she believed growth never truly ended. Her office door remained open to everyone, whether they were senior vice presidents or new interns beginning their first day. She answered every question with patience, always encouraging others to share their own experiences before offering advice. One afternoon, another board meeting gathered to review the company's next international expansion. As directors settled into their seats, Ethan Romano remained quietly near the windows, observing the room with thoughtful satisfaction. A newly hired executive entered carrying several reports and looked uncertain about where to sit. Before anyone else could respond, one of the senior directors stood, smiled warmly, and said, "Please, join us. Every perspective deserves to be heard." Ethan recognized the speaker immediately. Months earlier, that same man had laughed at Grace because of one imperfect sentence. Now he was the first person ensuring another newcomer felt respected. Grace noticed the exchange as well, and a quiet smile crossed her face. No speech was necessary because the lesson had taken root. When the meeting officially began, Ethan invited Grace to present the opening recommendations. As she stood before the board, every conversation stopped naturally. Every executive looked toward her with complete attention. No one noticed her accent anymore because they had learned to hear the wisdom behind her words instead of searching for flaws in their pronunciation. Grace spoke with calm confidence about partnership, responsibility, and the importance of honoring every community with sincerity. When she finished, the room remained silent for a brief moment before warm applause filled the space. Ethan looked around the table and realized that the greatest achievement of his career had never been building a powerful company. It had been helping people discover that dignity could never be measured by a job title, an accent, or perfect grammar. It was measured by integrity, humility, and the quiet courage to treat every person with respect before knowing what they could offer in return. And on that day, everyone in the room remembered what true dignity looked like.